Sister yelled at me like a maid over a coffee spill she didn't know I was her boss. Hi, I'm Aubrey. I used to think keeping the peace meant swallowing my pride until the day my sister treated me like hired help in front of her entire team. She screamed at me to clean up spilled coffee like I was the janitor, calling me workplace trash while everyone laughed. What she didn't know was that I owned the building she worked in, the company she ran, and had been bankrolling her success for 3 years. When I finally stopped playing the invisible benefactor, she dropped to her knees begging me not to destroy everything she thought she'd built. The elevator doors opened on the 15th floor of Sterling Corporate Tower at exactly 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. That would change everything. I stepped out into the marble lobby, my sensible flats making no sound against the polished floor. The reception area gleamed under LED lighting, all glass and chrome and corporate sterility. Fresh orchids sat in crystal vases on every surface, their white petals perfect and untouchable. I was early, like always. The morning rush hadn't hit yet, so the lobby was mostly empty except for a few junior executives clutching their morning coffee and scrolling through phones. I liked this time of day when the building felt calm, before the chaos of meetings and deadlines and corporate politics kicked in. I was heading toward the guest elevator bank when I heard the familiar click of designer heels against marble. Sharp, purposeful, demanding attention. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Kendall. My sister swept into the lobby like she owned it, which, in her mind, she probably did. Armani suit in midnight blue, hair styled in a perfect bob that probably cost more than most people's rent, makeup flawless despite the early hour. She was juggling her phone, a leather portfolio, and a venti coffee cup from the overpriced cafe downstairs. "Aubrey," she called out, her voice carrying across the space. Several people looked up from their phones. "Perfect timing, I need you to handle something for me." I stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Seattle skyline stretching out below us, the Space Needle pointing toward gray clouds that promised rain. The view cost me $12 million when I bought this building 2 years ago. Kendall admired it every day from her corner office, never knowing she was looking at my investment. "What do you need?" I asked, finally turning to face her. She was walking toward me, still focused on her phone screen, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I've got the Henderson presentation in 20 minutes, and I just realized we're missing the quarterly projections for the Pacific Division. Can you run up to finance and grab them?" I watched her approach, noting the way other employees stepped aside to give her space. She commanded the room without even trying, radiating the kind of confidence that came from believing you were untouchable. "I'm not sure I can," I started. "Great, thanks." She cut me off, not really listening. "You're a lifesaver. I don't know what I'd do without you." She was 3 steps away from me when it happened. Her heel caught slightly on the transition between marble tiles, just enough to throw off her balance. I watched in slow motion as she stumbled, her arms windmilling as she tried to recover. The phone went flying first, clattering across the floor. The portfolio followed, papers scattering like autumn leaves. And then the coffee. The cup seemed to hang in the air for a moment before gravity claimed it. It hit the marble with a wet crack, the lid popping off and sending 20 ounces of caramel macchiato exploding across the pristine white floor. The liquid spread quickly, seeping into the grout lines and creating a brown stain that looked like spilled blood against the perfect marble. The lobby went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. Even the soft jazz playing through the sound system seemed to pause. Everyone turned to look at the scene unfolding in front of the elevators. Kendall stood frozen, staring at the mess spreading around her feet. Her face cycled through emotions in rapid succession. Shock, embarrassment, and then something harder. Something that looked like rage. "Oh my God," she hissed, her voice low but carrying clearly in the silence. This is a disaster. She looked around the lobby, taking in the audience of employees and visitors who were watching her public humiliation. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Aubrey," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Clean this up." I blinked. "What? You heard me?" She gestured at the spreading stain, her voice rising. "Get some paper towels or something. I can't have clients seeing this mess." Around us, the audience grew larger. More employees had emerged from the elevator banks and were clustering around the edges of the lobby, watching the show. I could see junior executives whispering to each other, interns pulling out their phones. Even a few senior managers had stopped to observe. "Kendall," I said quietly, maybe we should—" "Don't argue with me," she snapped, cutting me off. "Just clean it up. That's what you're good at, right? Cleaning up messes?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Something that had been building for years. A young intern near the reception desk giggled nervously. Someone else whispered, "Brutal." But nobody stepped forward to help. Nobody questioned why the CEO was demanding that someone clean the floor like a janitor. I looked at my sister, really looked at her for the first time in a long time. Designer suit that cost more than some people made in a month. Jewelry that sparkled under the lobby lights. Hair and makeup perfect despite the early hour. She was everything I had helped her become, and she was treating me like I was nothing. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady despite the fire building in my chest. "You're absolutely right." I walked to the reception desk and grabbed a handful of paper towels from the dispenser. The receptionist, a young woman named Jennifer, looked at me with something like pity in her eyes. "You don't have to," she started. "It's fine," I said, taking the towels. I walked back to the spill and knelt down on the marble floor. The coffee was still warm, soaking through the paper towels and staining my fingers brown. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching me, could hear the whispered conversation starting up again. So embarrassing. I'd quit if someone talked to me like that. Who is she anyway? Some assistant or something? I cleaned up every drop, gathering the soggy towels and the pieces of the broken cup. Kendall stood over me the entire time, checking her watch and tapping her foot impatiently. "Make sure you get all of it," she said. "I don't want any sticky residue." When I was finished, I stood up and looked at her. She was already pulling out her backup phone, her attention already moved on to more important things. "Thanks," she said without looking up. "You're the best. I owe you one." She clicked away on her heels, leaving me standing in the lobby with a handful of coffee-stained paper towels and the echoing sound of her dismissal. The crowd began to disperse, the show over, but I could still hear the whispers following me as I walked to the trash can. "Poor thing. So humiliating. Who was that?" "Just some family friend, I think." I threw away the towels and walked to the elevator bank. As the doors closed behind me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel. Same face, same clothes, same woman who had built everything Kendall thought she owned. But something had changed. Something had shifted in that moment when she'd made me kneel on the marble floor while everyone watched and laughed. I pressed the button for the penthouse level, my level, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, a glass of wine in one hand and my laptop open in front of me. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but I wasn't looking at the view. I was staring at a folder on my desktop labeled Sterling Corporate Holdings Ownership Documents. My apartment was nothing like Kendall's flashy downtown condo with its exposed brick and industrial fixtures. Mine was understated, elegant, filled with books and art and comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than staged. I'd bought it for the view and the quiet, not to impress anyone. I opened the folder and began reviewing documents I hadn't looked at in months. Contracts, wire transfer receipts, legal agreements that told a very different story than the one Kendall had been telling the world. The story of how Sterling Marketing Solutions had really been built. 3 years ago, Kendall had been drowning. Her first startup had failed spectacularly, leaving her with massive debt and a reputation in shambles. She'd been living in a studio apartment in Belltown, working temp jobs and slowly watching her dreams crumble. I remembered the night she'd called me, sobbing into the phone at 2 a.m. "Aubrey, I don't know what to do," she'd cried. "I'm going to lose everything. The apartment, my credit, my future. I'm 28 years old and I'm a complete failure." "You're not a failure," I'd told her, sitting up in bed and turning on the light. "You took a risk. It didn't work out. That doesn't make you a failure." "Easy for you to say," she'd replied bitterly. "You've got your tech patents and your investments and your perfect little life. I've got nothing." I'd let the barb slide, like I always did. Kendall had always been competitive, always felt like she was living in my shadow. When I'd sold my first software patent at 24 for 8 figures, she'd been happy for me but also resentful. When I'd started my investment firm 2 years later, she'd called it playing with Daddy's money, even though every dollar I'd made had been earned through my own work. "What if I told you I had a business plan?" she'd continued. "Something that could really work this time." I'd say, "Show me the numbers." She'd arrived at my apartment the next morning with a presentation deck that was more optimism than strategy. Sterling Marketing Solutions would be a full-service digital marketing agency focused on mid-sized businesses in the Pacific Northwest. She'd done her research, identified the market gap, even lined up a few potential clients. "I just need capital," she'd said, pacing around my living room in nervous energy. "Enough to rent office space, hire a small team, cover expenses for the first year." "How much?" "2.5 million. I'd nearly choked on my coffee. "Kendall, that's..." "I know it's a lot," she'd rushed on. "But I've run the numbers. Conservative projections show we'll be profitable by month 18. Aggressive projections put us in the black by month 12. I'd studied her presentation, looking for flaws in her logic. But the truth was, it was solid. Overly optimistic in places, but the foundation was sound. She had the vision, the connections, the drive. What she lacked was capital and credibility. "I'll make you a deal," I'd said finally. Her face had lit up. "A loan? I can pay you back with interest." "Not a loan, an investment." I'd pulled out my laptop and opened a new document. "I'll give you the 2.5 million. In exchange, I want 60% of the company." She'd stared at me. "60%? That's majority control." "Yes, it is. But it's my idea, my business plan, my vision." "And my money," I'd said gently. "My money, my risk, my investment. You get to run the company, build your vision, prove yourself. I get to protect my investment." She'd been quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the sound. Finally, she'd turned back to me. "I'll do it," she'd said. "But I want to run the company my way. No interference, no micromanaging. You're a silent partner." Agreed. We'd shaken hands on it, and I'd had my lawyers draw up the paperwork. She'd signed without reading it thoroughly, too excited and too proud to admit she didn't understand all the legal language. For 3 years, I'd been exactly what she'd asked for, a silent partner. I'd never interfered in her decisions, never pulled rank, never even visited the office unless she specifically invited me. I'd let her run the company, let her take the credit, let her build her reputation while I stayed in the shadows. I'd thought I was being generous, supportive, the perfect investor who believed in her vision. Now I realized I'd been a fool. I opened my email and typed a message to my lawyer, James Patterson. He'd been handling my legal affairs for 6 years, ever since I'd made my first major investment. He was discreet, thorough, and had a reputation for getting things done quietly. James, it's time to exercise my rights as majority shareholder of Sterling Marketing Solutions. I want to call an emergency board meeting. How quickly can you arrange it? His response came back within 10 minutes. I can have the papers ready by tomorrow morning. The board can be convened by noon. Aubrey, are you sure about this? This is going to be messy. I stared at his message for a long time. Was I sure? This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about family, about the relationship I'd had with my sister since we were children. But then I thought about today, about kneeling on that marble floor while she stood over me, about the way she dismissed me like hired help while everyone watched and laughed, about the years of being invisible, of being the supportive sister who cleaned up messes and never complained. I typed back. It's already messy. I'm just going to clean it up properly this time. I hit send and closed the laptop. Outside, the city was settling into evening routines. People were heading home from work, stopping for dinner, meeting friends for drinks. Normal people living normal lives without the weight of family betrayal and corporate machinations. I poured myself another glass of wine and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, Kendall was probably having dinner at an expensive restaurant, celebrating another successful day at the company I'd built for her. She was probably telling her friends about her latest triumph, her newest client, her growing empire. She had no idea that her empire was built on my foundation, that her success was my investment, that her power was my gift. But she was about to learn. The next morning, I arrived at Sterling Corporate Tower at 6 a.m., 2 hours before Kendall typically rolled in. I used my owner's access card to get into the executive elevator and rode it to the 15th floor. The Sterling Marketing Solutions offices took up half the floor, all glass walls and open workspaces and modern furniture. I'd approved the lease myself, through my property management company. Kendall thought she'd negotiated a great deal with the building owners. She had no idea the building owners were me. I walked through the empty office space, past the reception area with its fresh flowers and corporate awards, past the conference rooms with their views of the sound, past the break room with its expensive espresso machine and artisanal snacks. Finally, I reached the corner office, Kendall's office. The nameplate on the door read Kendall Sterling, CEO in sleek silver letters. Through the glass walls, I could see her desk, her diplomas on the wall, her awards and accolades displayed like trophies. I used my master key to unlock the door and stepped inside. The office smelled like her perfume, expensive and floral. Her desk was organized chaos, papers and files arranged in what looked like random piles, but probably made perfect sense to her. On the credenza behind her desk sat a series of framed photos. Kendall accepting an award for Young Entrepreneur of the Year. Kendall cutting the ribbon at the office opening. Kendall shaking hands with the mayor at some corporate event. In every photo, she was alone. No mention of investors, no acknowledgement of the money that had made it all possible. Just Kendall, building her empire from nothing, pulling herself up by her bootstraps. I picked up one of the frames and studied it. She looked so proud, so confident, so sure of her own success. And why shouldn't she be? She'd worked hard, made smart decisions, built something impressive. With my money, on my foundation, through my investment. I set the photo back down and walked to the window. The view was spectacular, looking out over Elliott Bay toward the Olympic Mountains. On clear days, you could see Mount Rainier in the distance, snow-capped and majestic. I'd bought this building specifically for this view. I'd wanted Kendall to have the best office space in the city, the kind of environment that would inspire her and impress her clients. I'd given her everything she needed to succeed, and she'd repaid me by treating me like the help. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Board meeting set for 10 a.m., conference room A, all members confirmed. I typed back, perfect, I'll be there. By 8 a.m., the office was starting to fill up with employees arriving for work. I could hear the elevator dinging, the sound of conversations and coffee machines and printers warming up. The building was coming alive. I made my way to the conference room, where the board meeting would be held. Conference room A was the largest, with a polished mahogany table that seated 12 and a wall-mounted screen for presentations. The windows faced west, offering a view of the Sound and the mountains beyond. I'd handpicked every member of Sterling Marketing's board when the company was incorporated. There was Reed Kean, former VP of Operations at Microsoft. Sarah Chen, who'd built and sold 2 successful startups before 40. Michael Davidson, a marketing legend who'd worked with everyone from Nike to Starbucks. Jennifer Walsh, a financial expert who'd been CFO at 3 different Fortune 500 companies. And David Kim, a legal eagle who specialized in corporate governance. All of them had impressive credentials. All of them were experienced, intelligent, ethical people who understood business and fiduciary responsibility. And all of them owed their board positions to me. At exactly 10 a.m., they filed into the conference room, looking confused and slightly annoyed at being called in for an emergency meeting. I was already seated at the head of the table, my briefcase open in front of me. "Good morning," I said as they took their seats. "Thank you all for coming on short notice." "Aubrey," said Reed, settling into his chair. "What's this about? Where's Kendall?" "That's what we're here to discuss," I replied, opening my briefcase and pulling out a stack of documents. "But first, I need to remind everyone of something that seems to have been forgotten." I distributed copies of the incorporation documents, watching their faces as they recognized what they were looking at. "As you can see," I continued, "I am the majority shareholder of Sterling Marketing Solutions. I own 60% of this company. I have owned 60% since its inception 3 years ago." The room was quiet except for the sound of papers rustling as they reviewed the documents. Sarah looked up first, her expression thoughtful. "I remember these," she said. "But Aubrey, you've been completely hands-off. We haven't heard from you in... well, ever." "That's correct," I said. "I chose to be a silent partner, to let Kendall run the company without interference. That arrangement is ending today." "Ending how?" asked Michael. I pulled out another set of documents and distributed them around the table. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO. As majority shareholder, I'm exercising my right to assume operational control of the company." The room erupted in whispers and surprised murmurs. Jennifer leaned forward, studying the papers. "Aubrey, this is a hostile takeover of your own company?" "This is a course correction," I replied calmly. "The current leadership has lost sight of the company's values and mission. Changes need to be made." "What kind of changes?" asked David, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Starting with new leadership. I'll be assuming the role of CEO effective immediately." Reed's eyes widened. "But Kendall built this company. She's been the face of Sterling Marketing since day one." "Kendall has been the face," I agreed, "but she didn't build it alone. And she seems to have forgotten that." Just then, the conference room door burst open. Kendall stood in the doorway, her face flushed, her hair slightly disheveled. She'd clearly run up the stairs. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Aubrey, what are you doing here? And why is everyone looking at those papers?" The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They'd all worked closely with Kendall for 3 years. They respected her, liked her, believed in her vision. This was awkward for everyone. "Kendall," I said calmly, "please sit down. We need to discuss some changes to the company structure." "Changes? What changes?" She remained standing, her voice rising. "This is my company. These are my employees, my board. You can't just waltz in here and... Actually, I can. I gestured to the empty chair across from me. Please sit down. She looked around the room, seeing the faces of the board members, seeing the papers scattered across the table. Slowly, she pulled out the chair and sat down. I don't understand what's happening, she said, her voice quieter now, but still tense. I slid a copy of the incorporation documents across the table to her. You signed these 3 years ago, Kendall, when you took my money to start this company. She picked up the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she read. I watched her face as the reality sank in, as she processed what she was seeing. This says you own 60% of Sterling Marketing. I do. But that's impossible. This is my company. I built this from nothing. You built it with my money, I said quietly. $2.5 million of my money, my investment, my risk. The room was dead silent. I could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the rapid breathing of my sister as she tried to process what was happening. The board has reviewed the ownership documents, I continued. They understand the legal reality of the situation. Kendall looked around the table, seeing the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of people she'd worked with for years. You knew about this? You all knew? We knew Aubrey was an investor, said Sarah gently, but you've been running the company. We assumed you had majority control. I did have control, Kendall said, her voice cracking. This is my company, my vision, my work. Your work, yes, I agreed. Built on my foundation, funded by my investment, in a building I own, with equipment I purchased, using capital I provided. She stared at me across the table, and I could see the moment when everything clicked into place, when she realized that the empire she thought she'd built was actually a gift I'd given her. Yesterday, I said, my voice steady and calm. You humiliated me in front of your employees. You made me clean up your mess while everyone watched and laughed. You treated me like hired help. Aubrey, Do you know what they called me after you left? I asked. The cleaning lady. They actually thought I was the cleaning lady. Her face went pale. I didn't mean, I was just stressed. You know how much pressure I'm under. The pressure of running a company that was never really yours? She looked around the room again, seeing the reality of her situation finally sinking in. The board members she'd thought were loyal to her were actually loyal to their fiduciary responsibility to the majority shareholder. Me. You can't do this, she whispered. This company is my life, my reputation, everything I've worked for. And you can keep working for it, I said, as an employee, if you can prove you deserve to stay. I turned to address the board. I'm calling for a vote. All in favor of accepting my assumption of the CEO role? One by one, hands went up around the table. Reed looked conflicted but raised his hand. Sarah nodded as she voted. Michael, Jennifer, and David all followed suit. 5 out of 5. Unanimous. The vote passes, I said. I am now the CEO of Sterling Marketing Solutions, effective immediately. Kendall sat in stunned silence, clutching the ownership documents. Her face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, something that looked like panic. Please, she whispered. Aubrey, please, you don't understand what this will do to me, to my career, to everything I've built. I thought about all the years I'd been the supportive sister, cleaning up her messes, staying in the shadows while she built her empire on my money. All the times I'd swallowed my pride and let her take credit for my contributions. You're right, I said finally. I don't understand, because I would never treat my family the way you treated me. I stood up and addressed the room. This meeting is adjourned. Reed, I'll need a full operational report by end of day. Sarah, we need to discuss the Henderson account. Michael, let's review the client portfolio. Jennifer, I want to see the financials for the past quarter. David, please prepare the necessary documentation for the leadership transition. As the board members filed out, whispering among themselves, Kendall remained frozen in her chair. This isn't over, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, it is, I replied, packing up my briefcase. It's been over for a long time. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to her. You can stay on as senior account manager if you want. It's a significant demotion, but it's still a good position. The choice is yours. She didn't respond, just sat there staring at the papers in her hands. I left her in the conference room and walked to what was now my office. The nameplate on the door would need to be changed, but everything else could stay the same for now. I sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. Outside the window, Seattle was going about its business, oblivious to the corporate drama playing out 15 floors above the street. I had a company to run. The transformation of Sterling Marketing Solutions under my leadership was swift and decisive. Within the first week, I'd implemented new policies, restructured the management team, and begun restoring the company culture that had been slowly eroding under Kendall's ego-driven leadership. The employees who had watched me clean up coffee were now the same ones greeting me with, "Good morning, Miss Sterling," and asking for my input on their projects. The shift in dynamics was both palpable and revealing. I had no idea you were connected to the company, confided Marcus, one of the senior account managers, during a team meeting on Thursday. I mean, we all knew there was investor money, but we thought it was some venture capital firm or something. I preferred to stay in the background, I replied, but circumstances have changed. What I didn't mention was how many of them had participated in my humiliation just days earlier. The same people who were now deferential and respectful had been the ones whispering and laughing when Kendall made me clean the floor. Jennifer, the young intern who had giggled during my public embarrassment, knocked on my office door Friday afternoon. "Miss Sterling? Could I speak with you for a minute?" I looked up from the quarterly reports I was reviewing. "Of course. Come in." She entered nervously, wringing her hands. "I wanted to apologize. For Tuesday. In the lobby. I shouldn't have. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" I asked. That you're... She struggled to find the words. That I was a person who deserved basic respect regardless of my position in the company? Her face flushed red. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. It was unprofessional and unkind." I studied her for a moment. She was young, probably fresh out of college, learning how to navigate office politics and professional relationships. Her mistake was more about inexperience than malice. "Apology accepted," I said. "But remember this. How you treat people when you think they can't affect your careers says everything about your character." She nodded earnestly. "I'll remember that. Thank you for giving me a second chance." After she left, I turned back to my computer and found an email from James Patterson, my lawyer. "Aubrey, I've been monitoring the situation as requested. Kendall submitted her resignation this morning. HR has processed the paperwork. Thought you should know before it becomes official." I stared at the email for a long time. Part of me wasn't surprised. Kendall had always been proud, and working under her younger sister would have been unbearable for her ego. But another part of me felt something that might have been sadness. I'd hoped she would stay. I'd hoped she would see this as an opportunity to rebuild our relationship on more honest terms. Instead, she'd chosen to walk away, rather than face the reality of what our relationship had always been. That evening, I was working late in my office when the receptionist buzzed me. "Miss Sterling? There's someone here to see you. Says she's your sister." I looked up from the client proposals I was reviewing. It was almost 8 p.m., long after business hours. "Send her up?" A few minutes later, Kendall appeared in my doorway. She looked different, smaller somehow, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual power suits. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wasn't wearing any makeup. "I cleaned out my office," she said without preamble, holding up a cardboard box. "I thought you should know." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Sit down." She set the box on the floor and sat, looking around the office that had been hers just days earlier. It looks different already. I'd made a few changes, replaced her abstract art with landscapes, swapped her glass accessories for warmer wood pieces, added some plants to the windowsill. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make the space feel like mine. "How are you doing?" I asked. She shrugged. "I got a job. Morris & Associates offered me a senior position. It's a step down from CEO, but it's still good. That's a great firm. Congratulations." "Thank you." She was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the city lights. "I keep thinking about Tuesday, about the coffee." I waited for her to continue. "I was embarrassed," she said finally, "in front of all those people in my own lobby, and instead of dealing with that embarrassment like an adult, I took it out on you." "Yes, you did. I made you clean it up because I knew you would, because you always do. You always clean up my messes." I leaned back in my chair. "Why do you think that is?" She looked directly at me for the first time since she'd arrived. "Because you love me. Because you're my sister. And you've always been there to catch me when I fall." "And how did you repay that love?" Her eyes filled with tears. "By treating you like you were nothing. By forgetting that everything I had was because of you." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of 3 years of unspoken truth settling between us. "I want to apologize," she said eventually, "not just for Tuesday, but for everything. For taking credit for your investment. For pretending I built this company alone. For treating you like you were invisible." "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I was ashamed. Because I wanted so badly to prove I could succeed on my own that I convinced myself I had. Because admitting you were the reason for my success felt like admitting I was a failure." "You're not a failure, Kendall. You took my money and built something impressive with it. That's not failure, that's exactly what I hoped you would do. But I wrote you out of the story. I erased you from my success." "Yes, you did." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the view I'd bought for her. Do you think we can fix this? Our relationship?" I joined her at the window. Below us, the city sparkled with life cars moving through streets, lights in windows, people going about their evening routines. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Trust is like a piece of paper. Once it's crumpled, you can smooth it out. But it's never quite the same. But we can try." I looked at her profile, seeing the sister I'd grown up with underneath the ambitious executive she'd become. "We can try, but it has to be different this time. No more lies, no more taking credit for things you didn't do, no more treating me like I'm disposable." "I understand." "And Kendall?" "Yeah? If you ever treat me like hired help again, in public or private, this conversation will be the last one we ever have." She nodded. "I understand." She picked up her box and headed for the door, then paused. "Aubrey?" "Yes?" "Thank you for the investment, for the opportunity, for believing in me even when I didn't deserve it." After she left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the city I'd helped her conquer. The building was quiet now, just the hum of the HVAC system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from the young woman who'd made her first million with a software patent to the investor who'd built a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. I'd always preferred to work behind the scenes, to let others take the credit while I quietly built my empire. But sometimes, I realized, staying in the shadows wasn't kindness, it was enabling. By never holding Kendall accountable, by always cleaning up her messes without consequence, I'd created a monster who thought she could treat people however she wanted. The coffee spill had been a wake-up call, but not just for her. It had shown me that my generosity had boundaries, and when those boundaries were crossed, I was perfectly capable of reminding people who held the real power. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages that had been coming in all week. Congratulations from business contacts who'd heard about my new role. Meeting requests from clients who wanted to work directly with the real owner. Even a few interview requests from business journalists who were curious about the mystery investor who'd been funding Seattle's rising marketing star. One message caught my attention. It was from Sarah Chen, the board member. Aubrey wanted you to know the team is energized by the changes. Revenue is up 12% just this week, and we've had 3 new client inquiries. Leadership matters more than we realized. I smiled and typed back. Thank you. Sometimes the best way to support someone is to step back. Sometimes it's to step forward. I closed my laptop and gathered my things. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to build something meaningful. But tonight, I was going home to my quiet apartment with its beautiful view, content in the knowledge that I'd finally stopped being invisible. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level, and I walked across the marble floor where, just days ago, I'd knelt to clean up spilled coffee. The same marble, the same space, but everything had changed. As I pushed through the revolving doors into the Seattle evening, I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind people exactly who you are. And sometimes, the best way to clean up a mess is to stop making it in the first place. The building rose behind me, 15 floors of glass and steel and ambition. At the top, the lights were still on in what was now my office, casting a warm glow into the darkening sky. I'd built this empire from the shadows. Now it was time to rule it in the light. Aubrey completes her transformation from invisible investor to active CEO. The story ends with her reflection on how her past kindness had enabled Kendall's poor behavior, and her realization that sometimes stepping forward is more important than staying in the shadows. The company thrives under her direct leadership, and she embraces her role as the visible power behind the empire she built. The final scene shows her leaving the building she owns, no longer the person who cleans up messes, but the one who prevents them from happening in the first place.